The world has never been closer to a direct confrontation with Iran than it is right now. On February 12, 2026, former President Donald Trump issued a stark warning in Washington: Iran must disarm its nuclear program completely or face total war. The words were not just political theater, they were a declaration that the U.S. is prepared to escalate militarily if diplomatic channels fail. Within hours, intelligence assessments from the Pentagon confirmed that Iran is actively rebuilding missile sites destroyed in prior airstrikes, while uranium enrichment continues at the Natanz and Fordow facilities, reportedly nearing 60% purity. This combination of diplomatic threat and operational reality has sent shockwaves across the Middle East, rattling governments, businesses, and civilians alike. The U.S. Navy has repositioned the USS Abraham Lincoln and USS George H.W. Bush carrier strike groups to the northern Persian Gulf, while fighter wings in the UAE and Qatar are on heightened alert, signaling that contingency planning for rapid conflict is underway. This is not a distant crisis. This is a situation where every day brings the real possibility of missiles in the air and cities under threat. The immediate human consequences are being felt in real time. In southern Israel, local authorities report that civil defense sirens now sound multiple times a week. Schools operate with reinforced shelters. Parents sleep in shifts to monitor alerts, and hospitals keep emergency stockpiles of medical supplies ready in case of missile strikes. In Tehran, the population experiences a different but equally severe pressure. Hospitals are rationing care, delaying routine surgeries, and operating under strict energy limitations due to sanctions and banking restrictions. Citizens across the Gulf are bracing for the economic consequences as well. Shipping premiums through the Strait of Hormuz have doubled in the last month alone, and oil prices surged past $95 per barrel immediately following Trump's statement, highlighting how rapidly global markets react to escalatory rhetoric combined with operational developments. Even everyday goods, from food to fuel, are affected, demonstrating how deeply intertwined diplomatic tensions and civilian life have become. The psychological pressure is enormous. Families in Israel report chronic stress as sirens interrupt sleep, while Iranian citizens live under the shadow of potential airstrikes or missile accidents. The constant tension affects daily life, from children attending school to employees going to work, and is compounded by conflicting messages from leadership. While Trump projects unshakable confidence in U.S. military and diplomatic power, intelligence leaks and satellite imagery reveal active missile reconstruction and continued uranium enrichment in Iran, creating a dangerous gap between perception and reality. This disconnect is magnified by the media environment, where headlines tout diplomatic progress, even as nuclear and missile activity escalates. Ordinary citizens cannot distinguish between optimism in rhetoric and real-world preparation for conflict. Geopolitically, the situation is equally precarious. European allies, including France, Germany, and the UK, continue to push for renewed verification mechanisms, but enforcement remains weak, and Iran's leadership has rejected linking missile capabilities to nuclear negotiations. Israel, meanwhile, is intensifying its surveillance and defensive measures, while Gulf states brace for potential fallout. The combination of military readiness, economic vulnerability, and civilian exposure creates a volatile environment where a single miscalculation could rapidly escalate into regional war. This is compounded by Iran's regional proxies, which remain active in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, ensuring that any escalation would have ripple effects far beyond Iran's borders. The tension is not theoretical. Every element, from Trump's public ultimatum to missile site activity to the positioning of U.S. carrier strike groups, underscores that the crisis is immediate, tangible, and personal. Schools, hospitals, and businesses are all operating under contingency protocols, and ordinary citizens are living in a persistent state of alert. The clock is already running, and the cost of missteps is measured not in political points but in human lives and economic destruction. The world is being forced to watch as rhetoric, military capability, and geopolitical calculation converge, creating a high-stakes environment where the threat of total war is no longer abstract. It is a daily reality. The roots of the current crisis run deeper than headlines suggest. The dangerous standoff between the United States and Iran in early 2026 is the culmination of years of strategic missteps, political brinkmanship, and systemic failures. The initial fracture came with the Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA in May 2018, which eliminated the international framework that had limited Iran's uranium enrichment and imposed strict inspections. This unilateral move did not force Iran into submission. Instead, it created a vacuum that Tehran filled by accelerating its nuclear program and doubling down on missile development. Intelligence reports obtained by multiple Western media outlets confirm that Iran has steadily expanded its centrifuge networks at Natanz and Fordow, while simultaneously reconstructing missile sites damaged in previous airstrikes. By 2025, the uranium enrichment level reportedly reached near 60%, dangerously close to weapons grade levels, a direct consequence of gaps left by the U.S. exit from the nuclear deal. These technical steps were not widely publicized until satellite imagery leaked in late 2025, exposing the full scale of Tehran's progress and setting the stage for the explosive February 2026 ultimatum. The failure is not limited to Washington. European powers, including France, Germany, and the UK, attempted to mitigate the fallout with initiatives like INSTEX, designed to maintain limited trade channels for Iran under sanctions. While these mechanisms were well-intentioned, they lacked robust enforcement or incentives tied directly to Iran's compliance, allowing Tehran to continue enrichment and regional proxy operations with minimal immediate economic consequence. Reports from the European External Action Service indicate that by mid-2025, Iran had effectively bypassed INSTEX's limited financial tools through informal trading networks, underscoring the gap between political gestures and operational reality. This systemic failure, combined with inconsistent messaging from the U.S., left Iran believing that it could expand its nuclear capabilities without facing meaningful repercussions, further emboldening its leadership to resist disarmament. Domestically within Iran, structural and political dynamics exacerbated the situation. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has consistently framed missile development and nuclear capability as non-negotiable pillars of national defense. In his February 2026 public addresses, he reiterated that any external pressure to limit Iran's military industrial capabilities would be met with decisive response. These statements reflect a long-standing strategy where Iran uses nuclear and missile progress as both a deterrent and a bargaining chip in international negotiations. Coupled with U.S. political pressure, regional threats, and domestic legitimacy concerns, the Iranian leadership's decision to accelerate enrichment and rebuild missile sites was calculated, deliberate, and partially shielded from public scrutiny. The global community, while focused on negotiation optics, has only intermittently glimpsed the operational reality through satellite imagery and intelligence leaks. Missed warnings and partial truths have compounded the crisis. IAEA reports from late 2025 repeatedly flagged limited access to critical facilities, slow implementation of verification protocols, and continued expansion of uranium stockpiles. These reports were largely summarized in public statements without revealing the severity of Iran's technical advances, creating a dangerous perception gap. Analysts note that this lack of transparency contributed to misaligned expectations among policymakers in Washington, London, and Brussels, allowing Tehran to advance capabilities without triggering immediate punitive action. Every day that verification was delayed, enrichment continued and missile sites were rebuilt, creating a ticking clock that now frames Trump's February 12, 2026, total war ultimatum. The cumulative impact of these strategic failures is evident in Iran's operational posture today. Nuclear sites operate near weapons-grade capacity, missile programs are expanding, and regional proxy networks remain active in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Diplomatic engagement, while publicly described as ongoing, has so far failed to impose credible limits or incentives strong enough to alter Iran's trajectory. The current crisis is therefore not sudden. It is the logical result of policy withdrawals, enforcement gaps, ignored warnings, and structural weaknesses in international oversight, compounded by deliberate strategic choices from Tehran. What the public has not been told until now is that Iran's combination of nuclear readiness, missile rebuilding, and regional influence leaves only a narrow window for meaningful diplomacy. Every delayed inspection, every negotiation stall, and every partial enforcement measure has contributed to the exact scenario Trump described, a moment where disarmament is demanded under threat of total war and where failure to comply could spark immediate military escalation. The roots of this crisis lie not in a single misstep, but in years of compounding errors and calculated defiance, making the situation in February 2026 one of the most perilous in decades. The human and economic fallout from the escalating U.S. Iran crisis is no longer theoretical, it is unfolding in real time across multiple regions, touching ordinary lives in ways that make headlines seem abstract by comparison. In southern Israel, local authorities report that civil defense sirens now sound multiple times a week, forcing parents to sleep in shifts and children to attend schools with reinforced shelters. Hospitals operate under continuous emergency protocols, diverting resources from routine care to trauma readiness. Nurses describe working under extreme stress, improvising treatment and managing shortages of critical supplies, while parents report constant anxiety as they juggle daily life under the looming threat of missile attacks. This daily tension is compounded by Israel's advanced warning systems, which, while essential, also reinforce the psychological burden of living on the front lines of a near-war scenario. In Iran, the effects are equally stark but distinct. Hospitals are forced to ration care, delaying non-emergency surgeries, and relying on scarce imported medical supplies, hampered by sanctions and restricted banking channels. Ordinary citizens face an economy constrained by inflation, rising energy costs, and financial uncertainty. February 2026 reports indicate that staple food prices in Tehran have risen by more than 15% over the last 6 months, driven in part by sanctions enforcement and continued military expenditure on nuclear and missile programs. The Iranian population bears the cumulative weight of international pressure, internal prioritization of defense spending, and the constant specter of escalation, a reality that government statements downplay in order to maintain public confidence. The regional economy is cracking under the dual weight of fear and operational risk. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which carries nearly 20% of global crude oil, now faces heightened insurance premiums and security escorts. According to industry analysts in early February 2026, the combined effect of threat perception, insurance cost spikes, and potential attacks has effectively increased global energy costs by $15.20 per barrel in a matter of days, sending shockwaves through markets in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Small businesses across the Gulf report being forced to choose between paying for increased security measures or covering operational expenses, with layoffs already underway in critical service sectors. Tourism dependent economies, particularly in the UAE and Oman, have seen bookings drop sharply as international travelers factor in the risk of regional escalation. The economic pressure is immediate and tangible, directly affecting the livelihoods of millions of ordinary people, not just abstract markets. Even beyond the immediate Middle East, the ripple effects are severe. Inflation in energy-dependent economies such as India and Japan is rising as crude prices spike, while European nations dependent on Gulf oil are forced to adjust budgets and consider emergency stockpiling. Analysts warn that prolonged instability could reduce global economic growth projections for 2026 by up to 1.15 percentage points, creating cascading effects on employment, public confidence, and social stability worldwide. Every day that nuclear and missile programs continue in Iran without verification or tangible constraints, the economic and human toll compounds, demonstrating that strategic decisions at the state level translate directly into daily hardship for millions. Short human snapshots make the abstract consequences visceral. A nurse in Tehran, speaking anonymously in February 2026, described improvising patient care due to a shortage of anesthetics. A small business owner in Dubai reported laying off staff to cover skyrocketing insurance premiums for shipping goods through the Gulf. Parents in southern Israel recount the difficulty of sleeping through sirens while trying to care for children under constant alert. Each story underlines the reality: diplomacy and rhetoric are ongoing, but people on the ground live in a persistent state of near war, where everyday life is subordinated to survival and contingency, and yet, despite this unfolding human and economic chaos, decision makers remain in power. Supreme Leader Khamenei, the Trump administration, and regional allies continue to operate in a high-stakes environment where calculated escalation and brinkmanship dominate strategy. Ordinary citizens, hospitals, schools, and small businesses bear the immediate consequences, while the political elite maneuver, negotiate, and posture in ways that may determine the next flashpoint of a conflict whose cost is already measured in human suffering and economic disruption. The fallout is unmistakable, and the clock to further escalation is counting down. The question of accountability in the escalating U.S. Iran crisis is both urgent and uncomfortable. Responsibility lies not in a single actor or moment, but in a series of decisions, miscalculations, and ignored warnings that have compounded over nearly a decade. Former President Donald Trump's February 12, 2026, declaration that Iran must disarm or face total war is the culmination of policies initiated in May 2018 when the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA. That decision eliminated verification structures and removed the binding international oversight that had slowed Iran's nuclear advancements. Intelligence reports leaked in early 2026 confirmed that Tehran has steadily rebuilt missile sites destroyed in prior strikes and expanded uranium enrichment at Natanz and Fordow, actions that Western policymakers repeatedly warned could provoke a military confrontation. While Trump's statement frames the responsibility squarely on Iran, the systemic failures that allowed this escalation, inconsistent diplomacy, partial sanctions enforcement, and misaligned European strategies, are equally to blame. European mechanisms like Instex, intended to maintain economic incentives for compliance, were never effectively enforced, allowing Iran to continue development while presenting a public face of engagement. Iranian leadership, of course, bears direct responsibility for its own choices. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has repeatedly stated that missile programs are inviolable and that nuclear capability is a core component of national defense. Statements from February 2026 confirm that Iran views foreign pressure as a challenge to sovereignty rather than a pathway to negotiation, effectively eliminating voluntary compliance. Satellite imagery and intelligence intercepts indicate that Iran's regional proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen continue operations with both strategic and symbolic significance, signaling a willingness to escalate in response to any external threat. These actions have created a scenario where the U.S. and its allies must plan for contingencies ranging from cyber strikes to kinetic military engagement, while Tehran frames every defensive measure as a right to deterrence. The dual failure of diplomacy and compliance leaves populations across the region exposed to the human and economic consequences of brinkmanship. In the United States, accountability extends beyond political statements. Trump's February 2026 warning is stark, but it is built on years of inconsistent policy enforcement and intelligence management. Pentagon officials confirm that the USS Abraham Lincoln and USS George H.W. Bush carrier strike groups have been deployed since early February, highlighting a readiness for conflict that contrasts with diplomatic optimism portrayed in media narratives. Analysts note that repeated warnings from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and other monitoring bodies were only partially heeded, leaving a gap between operational realities and public perception. This discrepancy has created an environment where policy decisions are reactive rather than preventative, increasing the likelihood of miscalculation. The gap between public messaging and behind-the-scenes military preparation is stark. While political leaders speak of negotiation progress, defense budgets, carrier deployments, and missile tracking programs continue apace, regional allies are also accountable. Israel, while preparing civil defense and missile defense measures, has maintained a posture of limited public disclosure about its own operational readiness. Gulf states, including the UAE and Saudi Arabia, continue to invest heavily in advanced defense systems, insurance for shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and civil preparedness programs, reflecting the absence of confidence in diplomatic solutions. This collective focus on preparation over prevention underscores the high level of mistrust that has built over years of missteps, delays, and conflicting enforcement of sanctions. It is a network of accountability that stretches across continents, from Tehran's nuclear and missile policy to Washington's strategic decision-making to European and regional allies' partial measures and public assurances. The consequences of this misaligned accountability are already clear. Civilian populations are living under sustained alert, economies are stressed by rising energy costs and insurance premiums, and diplomatic channels are increasingly constrained by mistrust. Leaders from all sides continue to operate within a narrow margin of error, aware that one misstep could trigger escalation. Every action, delay, or miscommunication carries real human and financial costs, making the identification of responsibility not an academic exercise, but a measure of who must act now to prevent a full-scale conflict. While blame is multi-layered, the ultimate question remains: are those in power willing or able to bridge the gap between rhetoric, enforcement, and action before the next flashpoint ignites? The failure to ensure accountability at every level threatens not just regional stability, but global security, and the world is watching the consequences unfold in real time. The future unfolding from the U.S.-Iran standoff is far from abstract. It is a scenario that could reshape the Middle East, global energy markets, and international security for decades. If Iran continues its nuclear enrichment near weapons grade levels and persists in rebuilding missile infrastructure, the risk of direct military confrontation grows daily. Intelligence sources from early February 2026 indicate that Iran has reconstructed more than 70% of its previously damaged missile launch sites and is operating advanced centrifuge arrays at Natanz and Fordow capable of producing weapons-grade uranium within months if uninterrupted. The forward, deployed U.S. carrier strike groups, alongside allied air defense and reconnaissance assets in the Gulf, are poised for rapid response, signaling that any provocation or miscalculation could trigger immediate conflict. Global oil markets are already reacting. Brent crude has remained above $95 per barrel, Shipping premiums through the Strait of Hormuz are at historic highs, and insurance for maritime routes is skyrocketing, demonstrating that the economic fallout is not limited to the Middle East but reverberates worldwide. The human consequences of prolonged escalation are equally stark. In southern Israel, citizens live under continuous alert, with schools conducting drills and hospitals prioritizing emergency readiness over routine care. Parents juggle daily responsibilities against the anxiety of potential missile strikes, while healthcare workers report severe fatigue and resource shortages. In Tehran, hospitals are rationing care due to both sanctions and energy shortages, and ordinary citizens face inflation that has increased staple food prices by more than 15% in the past 6 months. Families are forced to make impossible choices, sacrificing long-term needs to survive in a climate of uncertainty. Across the Gulf, small businesses are closing or reducing staff to manage the skyrocketing costs of security and insurance, illustrating how a geopolitical standoff can ripple directly into the daily lives of millions. These pressures are compounded by psychological stress, which analysts warn could lead to long-term social instability even if immediate conflict is avoided. Economically, the projections are alarming. Continued tension threatens not only local economies but global supply chains. Shipping costs, insurance premiums, and energy prices are interlinked. Even minor disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz could push energy costs higher worldwide, destabilizing markets in Europe, Asia, and North America. Analysts warn that protracted uncertainty could slow global growth by 1.5 percentage points in 2026, while inflationary pressures force governments to cut social spending. Financial volatility could exacerbate inequality, leaving the most vulnerable populations, low-income families, migrant workers, and small business owners, exposed to severe hardship. Even temporary escalations, such as limited airstrikes or cyberattacks, would have cascading effects on employment, public confidence, and regional trade, creating a prolonged humanitarian and economic crisis. Strategically, the future is a high-stakes choice. Iran's leaders face the prospect of international isolation, further sanctions, and military escalation if they continue nuclear and missile development unchecked. U.S. and allied leadership must balance diplomacy with military readiness, aware that missteps could ignite regional war. European powers remain constrained by limited enforcement mechanisms, and regional allies like Israel and Gulf states continue to prioritize defense and civil preparedness over public diplomacy. The interplay of these decisions makes clear that the trajectory is not inevitable but contingent on urgent, coordinated action. Every delay in verification, inspection, or negotiation narrows the window for preventing escalation and increases the human, economic, and geopolitical cost of failure. The stark reality is that the consequences of inaction are cumulative and irreversible. Nuclear readiness in Iran, missile site reconstruction, and active proxy operations in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen create a scenario where a single miscalculation could trigger widespread conflict. Energy markets, public confidence, and regional stability are already strained, and continued escalation threatens a future of higher inequality, economic volatility, and human suffering. The question is no longer whether the situation will deteriorate, but how long populations, markets, and governments will tolerate the gap between rhetoric and actionable enforcement. The world is watching, but without immediate, decisive steps, the fallout of February 2026 may set a trajectory that shapes Middle Eastern and global security for decades to come. The ultimate question remains chilling: will leadership act in time to prevent disaster, or are we witnessing the early stages of a crisis that could spiral into total war, with consequences measured not just in political terms but in human lives and global stability?